Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Wednesday. My name is Bobby Blanchard, and thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. We're going to be talking about influencers and what you need to know, what brands really need to know about them headed into 2026. If you are a brand who works with influencers or you want to understand how consumers are engaging with influencers and consuming their content, this is the place for you. The research in today's webinar comes from a latest report, A Brand's Guide to Influencers in 2026. Now, this landscape of influencers is changing quickly as the idea of what an influencer is becoming more and more ubiquitous, and AI is becoming a bigger part of social media and content creation in general. So this report is going to be, exploring who's following influencers, what type of content people like, how consumers feel about AI in the influencer space, and more. I am going to pass it to my colleague Lindsay in a second to present on all that. But keep in mind, we will be taking your questions at the end of this webinar. So if you have any questions, please drop them in using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to as many questions as possible. Lindsay, the floor is all yours.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. And I want to thank you as well for joining today. My name is Lindsay Roschke. I am an analyst on the team here at Morning Consult. And while I do spend most of my time looking at the travel and hospitality and food and beverage sectors, I also sometimes get to dive into really fun cultural trends and research. And that was what led me to work on this project, to create this report and to come here and share it with you today. So I'm super excited. But before I dive in, I have a confession to make. I don't know if you all remember back in the early 2010s, Clout scores. At that time, social media was kind of in its infancy, and Clout scores were like the ultimate mark of digital cool. And mine was embarrassingly low, like so low. I couldn't get a free sample of vitamin water low. Like I think my Clout score was like 12 and it could go up to maybe 200. So it's very clear that I myself was never destined to be an influencer. But I think that's kind of what makes today so fascinating because the idea of influence has really changed so dramatically since those early social media days, which honestly really weren't that long ago in the grand scheme of things. We've kind of gone from this place of chasing vanity metrics to living in a world where influence can come from anyone and anywhere and no longer only the people with a blue check mark or the perfect aesthetic. So, as Bobby said, that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about where influence actually lives, which platforms people are following influencers on, how many creators they're engaging with, what types of content are resonating with which people, and even how open people are to AI generated content and AI generated influencers themselves. So, really interesting stuff. Um, I may have never cracked the influencer code myself, but I do have the data to explain how and why influence works as we look ahead to 2026 and what this all means for all of us trying to keep up no matter what your Clout score was in the early 2010s. So going on to the next slide, I want to give you just a kind of quick overview of what we're going to be going over today. So if there's one thing you can take away from this research, it's that consumers really just can't quit influencers. There are several who say there are too many influencers. There are lots of people who poke fun at influencers, but people are still following content creators en masse and they're still engaging with them too. As Bobby said, the landscape is changing really quickly. The idea of what an influencer is shifting. AI is becoming a bigger part of the social media and content creation experience. And at this time, consumers are really looking for transparency around how content is made and who is funding it in the first place. So we're really going to explore some of that evolving relationship between consumers and the influencers that they give their attention to. And I want to just go through kind of some of the key things that we will cover. First and foremost, social media is still very much an influencer's playground. So most consumers associate influencers with social media creators. But the term is becoming more ubiquitous and it's sort of expanding to platforms like podcasting. And as it does that, it's losing a little bit of its specificity. So we're going to explore that a bit. The second is that influencer fatigue is real. People may be following hundreds of influencers, but more than half of adults say that there are too many out there, which raises a red flag for potentially some growing fatigue in this space. Next, long form videos are really deepening connections with consumers. Gen Zers and men specifically say that long form video is their preferred influencer content type. And those that are watching those are really feeling a greater sense of connection and understanding with the influencers they follow. So, some really big opportunities there. And then last, AI. Can't not talk about AI. AI use is kind of expected in influencer content today, but so is transparency. Social media users really aren't surprised when the influencers that they follow leverage AI to create content, but they're expecting more transparency than they're getting about its use. So let's start with a little bit of a pulse check on influencers. So we're going to look at the kind of landscape today, how people define influencers, where they're following, the sort of general sentiment, just to get a lay of the land. So first, influencers in social media are very deeply entwined, and they have been for as long as influencers have been posting their, hashtag ads. I mentioned Clout Scores at the beginning and kind of in jest, but that was really truly the start of a phenomenon when brands were looking to content creators that had the most influence, that had the biggest hold over their audience for those coveted partnership opportunities. And that has really remained true through the explosion of mega influencers on Instagram and through to today. All this time, social channels have traditionally been the spaces where influencers have found and grown and cultivated their following and their own brand. But that said, social media content creators are not the only personalities that consumers classify as influencers. So more traditional figures can be considered influencers. More than half of consumers say that celebrities are influencers, and nearly half say reality stars are. And then at the same time, newer profiles like podcasters are emerging. That's a kind of new title in the last couple of years, and they are increasingly being considered influencers by consumers as well. And then notably for brands who are crafting an influencer strategy, brands themselves can be considered to be influencers by many. That's true more often of large brands than it is of small ones, but still notable for both. And 25% of adults say that CEOs and executives can be considered influencers as well. Not all demographics define influencer in the same way. That's something that's kind of notable throughout this presentation. You'll see a lot of demographic breakdowns because there are a lot of nuances across the influencer landscape that are different for different demographic groups. So for example, for this one, Gen Zers are more likely than others to say that celebrities and reality stars and podcasters are influencers. So they have a little bit of a wider definition. But they're also more likely to say that social media content creators are always influencers. So 50% of Gen Zers say that social media content creators are always influencers. So this really suggests a kind of ubiquity of influencers in Gen Z's lives. And as a result, maybe a little bit of a difficult time defining who they are because anybody can be an influencer these days. So looking on to the next slide, I want to look a little bit at platforms. So despite some lingering uncertainty about its future in the US, TikTok has unsurprisingly really firmly entrenched itself as the top platform for influencers. So among those who use TikTok, nearly 2/3 say that they follow influencers on it. And in comparison, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, they all have higher usership numbers, but the share of users who follow influencers on the platforms is lower. Naturally, there are some differences in demographics here. And at first glance, if you look at this chart, you may try to explain some of those differences away by usership, right? So Gen Z is the highest for TikTokers. Of course, Gen Zers are more likely to be on TikTok than other generations. But what I want to note here is that this data only represents users of each platform. So among Gen Z users of TikTok, millennial users of TikTok, which means that the differences that you see here actually reveal some deeper nuances in the influencer sphere and in influencer engagement. So for example, one of the things that I find quite interesting is among users of TikTok, women are slightly more likely to follow influencers than men. But on every other platform, men who are users are more likely to follow influencers than women. I'm going to talk a lot about some of those gender differences throughout the presentation because I think there were some really interesting things that popped up that warrant unpacking. Now, of course, these are not the only platforms where people follow influencers. We also asked about things like podcasts, blogs, Substacks, other newsletter platforms, and we found that influencers are drawing notable audiences on those channels as well. So, for example, over a third of adults say that they follow or keep up with influencers on podcasts. And a slightly smaller, but still pretty notable share say the same for blogs, newsletter platforms, and even live events. So those kind of live influencer shows that people are looking for tickets to. So their influence is also ubiquitous, kind of all over the place in all channels and in all spaces for consumers. All right, going on to the next slide, with the sort of variety of platforms that are available for influencer engagement, it does make logical sense that many consumers follow a pretty broad swath of influencers, but just how broad that swath is kind of depends on the individual. It's probably not going to come as a surprise to anybody that Gen Zers are the most likely group in general to follow influencers, whether they're following one or 100. But what's more, along with millennials, Gen Zers are more likely than older consumers to say they follow a large number of influencers. This was really striking to me. 28% of Gen Zers and 27% of millennials follow 100 or more influencers. And 10% of millennials say they follow 300 or more influencers. I mean, no wonder we're exhausted all the time. That's just so much content coming at you and really, really hard to cut through the clutter. There's also a gender gap here. So men follow more influencers than women. They're 7 points more likely to say that they follow more than 100 influencers. But the other thing that I want to call out on top of what's super interesting on this chart is that this chart doesn't actually even tell the whole story, because it's also crucial to understand that the number of influencers followed does not equal the number of accounts or profiles a consumer is exposed to. Most consumers say that they follow at least some influencers on multiple platforms. I mean, think about it. How many people do you follow on TikTok and Instagram and many other platforms? Millennials tend to cross the most platforms. 14% of millennials say that they follow their favorite influencer on at least 5 different channels. So they may not be following 300 influencers on 5 channels, but all of that adds up to just so much content. And what that tells us is that influencer content is really, truly ubiquitous and that cutting through the messaging clutter is kind of harder than ever. All right, so going on to the next slide, consumers may follow many influencers, but the ones that they tend to like the most usually are the ones with the biggest following. So we asked for your favorite influencer and for the influencers you follow on average, how big is their community? How many followers do they have on a platform? Nearly 3 in 10 US adults said that their favorite influencer has more than 1 million followers, and that's more than double the share of any other number. And in comparison, when asked about the influencers they follow on average, only 19% said that they have a following of 1 million or more. So, of course, the average influencer has a lower following, but favorite influencers tend to be the pretty heavy hitters. Now, of course, demographic differences. Compared with older generations, Gen Zers are much more likely to say that their favorite influencer is a big name. So 28% of adults in general, 46% of Gen Zers say that their favorite influencer has more than 1 million followers. They're also more likely to say that the influencers that they follow have more followers on average. So a really kind of big testament to the power of the large influencer, the mega influencer, But I also want to call out that this does not erase the power or influence of micro influencers who really play their own unique part in the influencer ecosystem. And that group is particularly successful among demographic groups like lower earners, who are more likely than others to say that the influencers they follow have an audience of less than 1,000. And of course, these influencers play a part when it comes to hyperlocal recommendations, having more of that kind of sense of community and connection with their audience compared to a 1 million plus influencer who really is just kind of a celebrity at this point. All right, so going on to the next slide, perhaps the ubiquity of influencers in both number and in definition is leading to a sense of fatigue amongst consumers. So when we asked about the number of influencers on social platforms today, just over half of US adults said that there were too many. 51% said that there were too many influencers. And that's 20 points more than the share who say there are about the right amount of influencers. So a big, big difference. And what's more, only a tiny, tiny fraction, 2%, say there are too few influencers, despite the fact that it sometimes seems like new ones are emerging every single day. So this is really pointing to perhaps a growing sense of fatigue. Of course, there are some demographic differences, and older consumers who tend to be a little bit less engaged on social media in general and think of social media more as a means to kind of connect with family and people that you know, they are more likely than others to say that there are too many influencers. There's a sort of inverse relationship between that engagement with social media and the way that people think about whether or not there are too many influencers. But what's really notable here is those Gen Z and millennial numbers. 42% of Gen Z adults and 44% of millennials. These are the generations that are most engaged in influencer content, also think that there are too many influencers out there. And what's more, looking at this one other way, we cut this question only by people that say they follow influencers to see if it was different, right? Like maybe the general public thinks there's too many influencers, but what about people that are following influencers? 46% of those people still said that there are too many influencers out there. So it's a general feeling amongst the public. We really can't deny that. And the perception might not be resulting in completely disengaged consumers quite yet. Obviously people are still following influencers, still looking to them for recommendations and for inspiration, but it really should raise some warning flags for brands who are hoping to stand out in this very increasingly crowded space. All right, going on to the next slide. So there is this perceived oversaturation of influencers, but despite all of that, it still does appeal to many as a potential career path. And this is particularly true for Gen Zers and millennials. More than half of those younger generations said that they would definitely or probably consider being an influencer. That's compared to just over a third of adults in general, 35% of adults in general, compared to more than half of Gen Zers and millennials. Men are also far more likely than women to express some interest in becoming an influencer. And what you see on the chart here on the screen are the major reasons that those who said that they were interested in becoming an influencer said that they would want to do so. The primary reason is that it's seen as a lucrative career. So among those who would consider being an influencer, 58% said a major reason that they would do so is because it's good money. Now, again, we're not looking at people who say that they would be an influencer as their only job. So perhaps the ability to earn some extra money in addition to a full-time job is something that's appealing here. But I do think it's really fascinating to compare that motivation to some of the other, because, money isn't the only goal. Nearly as many said that they would do it for personal fulfillment, to be creative, to have fun, to have a flexible career, or even some benevolent reasons. Some people said they wanted to do it to make a difference in the world. But the thing that I find particularly interesting is what came in last place, and that's fame and recognition. And those are things that I know I would have assumed would be a driver for pursuing a career in influencing. I want to become famous. I want people to know who I am. Those are actually the least common reason by a fair margin compared to some of those other things. So people are really interested in the idea, especially young people, of becoming an influencer. That said, they are not naive about the effort that it takes to become a successful influencer. So overall, 37% said that it would be somewhat or very difficult to become an influencer. And the thing that they said would be the most difficult would be maintaining their fan base. So for people who want to be influencers, they don't necessarily see the kind of content creation piece as the hard part. They are seeing that, that kind of growing the community and maintaining the community are the pieces that are the most difficult. All right, so we've talked about the content creators. I want to go on to the next section now and talk a little bit about the content. So what type of influencer content is resonating and what is turning followers away? I want to just pause for a second because I saw a question come up about younger Gen Zers or teens. I do want to call out that the Gen Z sample within this survey and this report does include all Gen Z. So typically we only survey Gen Z adults, but given the importance of the influencer landscape for Gen Z as a population, we ran a general population survey and also a specific Gen Z survey. So we did include all Gen Z in this survey. So you'll see there's another slide later where I do break out older and younger Gen Z, but for all of the other questions where Gen Z is asked, it is Gen Z from the beginning of the generation on. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that so people could kind of have that context. We'll do the other Q&A questions at the end, but I wanted you to have that context in mind while we're going through the data. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the content side. You know, what type of influencer content is resonating, and even more interestingly, what is potentially turning people away? So first, let's take a look at how people feel about the influencers that they follow. So going on to that next slide, for many consumers, their phone is the first thing they see when they wake up in the morning, and the last thing they see before they go to bed at night. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is not necessarily for me to say, but I do think that it's a reason that consumers feel pretty intimately connected with their favorite influencers. Some may even call it a parasocial relationship. No judgment, but honestly, a little bit of judgment because more than 1/4 of US adults say that they know their favorite influencer very well. Very well. I'm not kidding when I tell you I saw this data and I immediately slacked the rest of the team when I was going through it. I was like, can you believe more than 1/4 of adults say they know their favorite influencer very well? And only 9% say they don't know their favorite influencer well at all. And please keep in mind, in the vast majority of these cases, they do not actually know this person. So judginess aside, there is a real feeling of intimacy between consumers and the influencers that they follow. And one likely reason for that feeling of intimacy is that influencers tend to really be open books when it comes to sharing. So over 1/4 of adults say that their favorite influencer shares a lot about his or her personal life. And mostly consumers are okay with that. Around 2/3 say that the influencers that they follow generally share the right amount of content about their personal lives. And only 16% say they share too much. I do want to note the difference between men and women on this one. Again, there are some gender differences, and 23% of men say that they wish the influencers they followed shared more about their personal lives. So it really, again, kind of highlights the fact that they're a demographic that's very much hungry for more content from the influencers that they follow. But what kind of content exactly? Well, going on to the next slide, you can see a bit of a breakdown there. And given the nature of the vast majority of social media content, it is logical that short form videos are the most commonly consumed content forms across all demographics. So, you know, with Instagram and Facebook following the lead of TikTok, spotlighting reels, even changing the Instagram gallery to be vertical rather than that kind of long-standing square format, short form videos are everywhere these days. They're not going away anytime soon. They're the kind of content form of choice. But the differences in other formats are really notable. And the one that I think particularly stuck out to me was long form videos. These are particularly popular among men. So men are 9 points more likely than women to say that this is the type of influencer content that they consume the most often. And honestly, thinking back to that last slide, I think this is one of the reasons that we see more men claiming to know their favorite influencer very well. They've likely just spent many more hours, you know, with them than those who are consuming short form videos or images alone. And there's a similar gap between Gen Zers. among whom 26% consume long form videos the most often, and millennials, who are more likely to favor photos. So there's one more way to look at this data. We asked the question that's charted here. So this represents what content form you consume the most often. So select only one. But we also asked the question, what content form do you consume in general, where they could select as many as they wanted rather than just the one? And what we found when asking the question that way is that while long form video is the second most likely content form to be consumed most often, it's not the second most popular overall. So considering all content consumed, adults were more likely to choose photos and live streams, with long form landing in the fourth spot overall. And that really suggests that long form videos, potentially are not for everyone, but those that are watching them are really deeply engaged and often hungry for more. All right, going on to the next slide, we also asked some questions about the type of content respondents typically consumed. And as you can see from the chart here, there was really no one type that emerged as the single most popular. So tied for most common are day in the life videos. So again, underscoring that notion that influencers share a lot about their personal lives, and movies or TV clips. But even those kind of garnered a yes from well under half of respondents. As with most questions about social media, and as I said before, there are demographic differences to consider. So baby boomers are more likely to consume how-to or instructional videos and recipes. Gen Zers like get ready with me videos. Millennials tend to favor reviews. And I think these differences are really interesting because they underscore the value that different consumer groups place on influencers. So for example, baby boomers, they're seeking out guidance and instruction. Millennials want a trusted resource for feedback. And Gen Zers are looking for a kind of blend of advice and humor and personal connection. So I think it's interesting to kind of look at this as a whole, and then also as some of those demographic differences as well. And then we also asked a question about the theme of influencer content. So for example, do you prefer fashion, lifestyle, home decor, something else? And similarly to what we saw with the content type, there was really no one clear winner that stood out above it all. The theme of content that people said they most commonly, or that consumers were most likely to say that they were consumed, was comedy content. So 40% of consumers said that they typically watch, or social media users said that they typically watched comedy content. And that was followed by food and drinks. But even that only garnered about 38% agreement. So nothing gets a majority, even though it's a sort of select all question. And it just goes to show that consumer preferences are really all over the map. Everything is highly personalized, and there's likely an influencer or 5 or 10 or 100 for everyone's unique individual taste. All right, going on to the next slide, one thing that I was super, super excited to explore in this survey was what makes people unfollow influencers. Because consumers may feel like they know their influencers very well, but despite that connection, or maybe even because of it, they can be pretty fickle. We asked a question around how often people unfollow influencers, and 16% said that they do so at least once a week. 29% said that they do at least once monthly. So people are kind of culling out their influencer list, even though they're following, hundreds, and removing the people that they really feel are not adding value to their lives anymore. So to avoid an unfollow, we found that influencers must first and foremost deliver on the very nebulous concept of interesting content. I know that's tough to define, but it does show what consumers are looking for in their influencers. Most people who had unfollowed an influencer said it was because they simply lost interest in their content. So no longer relevant to their lives, what have you. But that said, there are some specific watchouts, some of which are demographic driven. So for example, millennials are more likely to unfollow if an influencer posts too much content and also too little content. So maybe we could write that off as millennials being impossible to please, but I do think it kind of underscores the need to establish a consistent posting cadence and not do anything that feels too jarring or surprising or unexpected once somebody has decided to give that influencer a follow. Millennials and women are also more likely than their counterparts to say that they had unfollowed an influencer because that person posted something that was offensive. Make sure that content is reviewed as much as possible. And again, here we see the male tendency to want more content. When you look at the men versus women and why they've unfollowed, men are 13 points more likely than women to say that they've unfollowed an influencer for not posting enough. So kind of always looking for more, always hungry for more, wanting more content from the influencers that they follow. Now that's content in general, but what about sponsored content? If you go to the next slide, we'll see that most social media users are pretty realistic about the fact that influencers sometimes or often share content that is sponsored or promotional. So only 5% of US adults say that the influencers they follow never post sponsored content, with more than 2 in 5 saying they do so always or often. I think in today's landscape, it's really seen as part and parcel of being an influencer. Consumers recognize it as a business and they know that the influencers have to get paid somehow, especially the ones that are doing it full time. It is a lot of work. However, it is expected that influencers are transparent about when their content is promotional. Now, the good news is that a majority of adults say that that is currently the case. So 53% of US adults say that the influencers that they follow are always or often explicit about their content being sponsored. And while certain demographics, like younger consumers, are more likely to say that the influencers they follow do post sponsored content, there's a general agreement across demographic lines that influencers are pretty transparent about the promotional nature of their content. So I think that's really just become part of the influencer landscape. No one is, not savvy about the fact that influencers do need those brand partnerships, and especially because they know that being an influencer can be a lucrative career. They just want some kind of honesty and transparency about it. And that leads us to our last section, because I think honesty and transparency is a really big theme of the data that we uncovered on AI and influencers. So we're going to wrap up by talking a little bit about the impact of AI, how it is already changing the landscape, and what may happen in the future. So starting out, it is, of course, impossible to ignore the meteoric rise of AI in all sectors, but the influence and the impact that it's already having on the influencer landscape. When we asked, we found that more than 1 in 5 adults say that the influencers that they follow use AI in their content always or often, with men and millennials being more likely than their demographic counterparts to say so. So it's there, and people are recognizing it. Similarly to sponsored content. They're not dumb, they recognize that it's happening. However, consumers are also recognizing the use of AI by brands and companies, and they're even slightly more likely to say that brands use AI always or often compared with influencers. Now, I do want to say that the use of AI isn't necessarily a bad thing in consumers' eyes. We also asked when influencers and when brands and companies should use AI. Should they never use it? Should they always use it? Should it only use it when it makes sense or is appropriate? And people tend to say that they should use it when it makes sense for the project. And of course, people who are more amenable to AI, younger consumers, high earners, men, are more likely to say, yeah, it's okay to use AI in your influencer content or in your brand content. But I think there's a kind of deeper story here beyond just the recognition. If we go on to the next slide, I think this data was what really stood out to me the most in the kind of AI, the AI questions that we asked. I mentioned this when I was talking about sponsored content. It's very similar story in that social media users generally feel like it is necessary for influencers to just be transparent about their use of AI in content, right? They recognize that it's there. They're generally okay with it being used, but they want transparency about it. So among US adults in general, 41% say influencers should always disclose AI use. And again, expectations rise along with the consumer's age. So there's a sort of inverse relationship between openness to AI and how much people think that AI should be disclosed whenever it's being used for content. But what I think is particularly interesting about this data is the huge gaps between the light blue bars, the shares who say that influencers should disclose whether content is AI generated, and the dark blue bars, which are the share that say that they always do share when AI has been used in content. So 41% say that influencers should always disclose AI use, and only 14% say that they actually do share when AI has been used in content. As was true with the previous slide, we also asked this question for brands and companies. So we said, should they disclose whether AI is being used in their content or their marketing? And do you feel that they currently do so? And we found that expectations were pretty similar, although like slightly heightened. So 44% of adults said that brands and companies should definitely disclose AI usage. And a slightly lower share, only 12%, said that they always do so. So again, their expectations for transparency are just simply not being met when it comes to AI usage. And as we saw the kind of evolving of sponsored content over time, where it used to have to be hidden in order to feel authentic, and now it's just kind of clear and out in the open, I think we're going to see that same kind of pathway for AI in the way that its use evolves in influencer content and branding content in general. All right, so the immediate impact of AI on the influencer landscape mostly relates to AI generated content. That's kind of the issue that we're dealing with today. But there is a future, and possibly a very near one, in which the influencers themselves are AI generated. And while consumers in general are not overly interested in AI influencers, just over a third said that they would be very or somewhat likely to follow an AI influencer. There is heightened interest when considering an AI version of their favorite influencer. So that means that the familiarity with the influencer kind of leaves consumers open to AI usage in a way that they're not about just the concept of influencers in general. And what's more, there's some outsized interest or appetite for AI influencers in general, as well as AI versions of existing influencers among users of specific social media platforms. So while users of the larger platforms, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, are a little bit less amenable, those who use more niche platforms like Twitch and Discord are far more interested. Obviously, there are demographic nuances here, right? So users of Twitch and Discord are more likely to be young, more likely to be male, and those are people who are also more likely to be open and amenable to AI usage. But I do think, it does suggest, maybe some smoother inroads to resonating with this group when it comes to AI on those particular platforms. And then one watch out for brands who are considering the way that AI fits into an influencer strategy. And this is the slide that I nodded to earlier, where we split out young and older Gen Zers. Younger Gen Zers are actually less interested in this concept than older ones. So 24% of young Gen Zers said that they would follow an AI influencer, compared with 39% of older Gen Zers. And I think this is really fascinating because the way that technology usually evolves is that younger people tend to embrace technology, become more fluent in it. And so you would assume that the younger Gen Zers may have more of an appetite or an openness to it than older Gen Zers. But we're sort of seeing the opposite when it comes to AI. In fact, in our kind of broader AI research, millennials are more amenable and open to it than Gen Zers are. So perhaps the pendulum is swinging a little bit in the other direction for this generation. The difference here isn't necessarily due to a gap in trust or favorability when it comes to AI. When we look at those numbers, any differences between the share of older and younger Gen Zers who say that they trust AI or feel positively about it are all within the margin of error. So there's no huge differences there. But what I do think is potentially worth considering is that younger Gen Zers have had less exposure to AI than their older counterparts, right? They're, maybe less active on social media and seeing fewer accounts. When asked how often influencers they follow use AI in their content, 61% of younger Gen Zers said rarely or never. 39% of older Gen Zers said rarely or never. So they just have kind of less exposure to it. So perhaps as these younger consumers have more exposure to social media and influencers and AI in general over time, it may soften their stance, but that certainly remains to be seen. All right, so here I am, end of the presentation, waving my Clout score of 12 in the air, looking for my first SponCon deal, hoping that an AI version of me is not going to just swoop in and take away my brand partnerships. But seriously, I think what we've seen today and what I find is really important to take away in this data is that influence, isn't just about follower counts or filters anymore. It's about trust and relevance and authentic connection. Consumers are getting savvier. They know they're being sold to. They reward creators who feel real, whether that's a mom on TikTok or a gamer on Twitch or even an AI avatar who just seems to get them somehow. And so I think for all of us, the opportunity now is to think less about influencers as a category and more about influence as an ecosystem. So one that extends across platforms, across personalities, and even across technologies. So no, I may not have been influential back in the clout days, but I'm hoping today that I've influenced a few of you to think a little bit differently about when, where, and how influence really happens and how you're going to integrate it into your role and your work. So I want to say thank you so much for your time, and I'm going to hand it back over to Bobby to, I think, show you a little bit about Morning
Yeah.
Consult Pro.
Thank you so much, Lindsay, for that. I know you influenced me to think about cloud for the first time about 14 years. So that in itself is an accomplishment. I have long, long
Amazing.
buried memories of that platform deep, deep inside my head. Well, thank you so much for that. That was a lot of great of analysis and data. I'm going to give you a little bit of a break, a chance to get a glass of water before we dive into the audience Q&A. And while you're doing that, I want to remind folks where this research comes from and how they can access it themselves after this webinar. So I am going to share my screen really quickly here. Um, oops, there we go. So the research you saw in today's webinar came from a report we recently published called A Brand's Guide to Influencers in 2026. You can find this report on pro.morningconsult.com, where all of our research lives. Now, we publish on economic, political, brand, and marketing trends, and all of that research is available to our subscribers and clients. So, for example, if you wanted to find the report on influencers, you see it right here on our homepage. You can also go to our report library and find it there as well. Now, this is going to have, a summary, some key takeaways, the download button, and we always have the methodology at the bottom of our reports as well. So I think there was one audience member who asked about our methodology, when was this survey, what sample size? We have all those details spelled out here. All this analysis we publish on pro.morningconsult.com is powered by several different Morning Consult research offerings, including custom research like this report and our data platform called Morning Consult Intelligence. Um, this platform provides unparalleled insights and tools to measure global consumer trends, audience profiles, and brand monitoring in real time. So, for example, if I wanted to look into some Gen Z trends, some Gen Z demographic details, I go to the audience tab. I can type in generation Gen Z. Oops, if I can spell correctly. I can type in Gen Z, and that will pull up the Gen Z audience. And that will tell me, this group's social media usage, their streaming service usage, what the decision drivers and motivators are, what some of their behaviors look like, be it shopping or travel. You can also see this is coming from all time that we've surveyed this audience, and we have more than 1.8 million surveys from Gen Z respondents. This is available to Morning Consult clients. If you don't have access to Morning Consult Intelligence but are interested in learning more about the product, please reach out to our team at pro@morningconsult.com, and we'd be happy to connect and, show you more about it. So with that in mind, let's dive into some audience Q&A. Lindsay, I want to start us out with, again, talking about some gender differences. Now, you talked about that a lot throughout this presentation, but it did seem like there were some really notable gender differences in this data. Can you talk about why that might be the case? Like, that seems a little surprising. Like, what's the reasoning there?
Yeah, I was super surprised by this, honestly, and I think the reason that I was is because influencer culture is stereotypically female. I think when we think of influencers, we think of makeup tutorials and shopping hauls and things like that that do skew very kind of female in gender identity. But we really found in all these questions that men are more deeply engaged. I think for me, the simplest way to look at it would be about how many influencers they follow. And, men on pretty much all platforms were more likely to follow influencers than women to keep up with them off social media, all those sorts of things. We did get another question that's somewhat related to this too. Somebody asked, men follow more influencers, but were there details on why or on whether they follow more men or women influencers? We did not ask specifically what gender of influencer you follow. That would be a really interesting question to kind of follow up with. But I do think if you just consider the influence of the so-called manosphere, influencers, podcasters that are like truly integral in shaping men, especially young men, when it comes to all aspects of life, my gut would say that men are following more male influencers. And again, that long form content is a really important point too. I found that to be the most interesting thing, that difference in the preferred content format. I talked about this earlier, but that difference, 21% of men say that long form videos are their most frequently consumed content type compared to 12% of women. So they feel like they know the influencers deeper, they're more connected to them, and they're getting more from them that's less about just, product or brand recommendations, but really kind of deep identity shaping characteristics. And so I know that we talked a lot about this in pop culture, and I regret that we can't answer the question like what gender influencers are people following more often. But my gut would say that men, especially young men, Gen Z men, are more likely to be following those influencers that are in the so-called manosphere, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that definitely tracks with sort of my reading of the internet these days as well, I think, Lindsay. Um, Jumping around a little bit, we also got a question about AI influencers.
Mm.
Why would a consumer follow an AI influencer if they'll, especially looking for that connection, right? Like if they're after the how-tos, day in the life, review videos, what sort of information could AI share that would be helpful, interesting in those contexts, given that like an AI doesn't have a day in the life video to make, or at least not that I'm aware of. That would be really interesting, seeing ChatGPT talk about the moon question gets asked every day, but like that's not the same thing, right? Like why would someone want to follow an AI influencer?
I mean, my gut says that eventually, because AI influencers will look and feel and sound just like regular influencers, but with all of the knowledge of an LLM, right?
Mhm.
So instead of seeing, this one person who maybe has a lot of information about, a certain type of thing that you're interested in, all of a sudden you're watching an AI influencer who looks and feels like a real influencer or like a real person, but also has that knowledge behind them. I can't remember there's a like an AI actress or something like that. I don't
Mhm.
follow Hollywood that much, but like a big hubbub about an AI actress and kind of union issues and everything like that. And I think that is a sign of some of the things that could potentially come. So when we're thinking of AI influencers, I'm thinking of a person who, is in theory indistinguishable from any other influencer that you may follow. You don't know them in person, you don't see them in person, and so how would you know? Tilly Norwood, thank you. That's the one. So I think it's that, and it's not necessarily at this point that people are maybe processing it that way, but I do think that that could potentially become a reality and maybe even threaten more kind of traditional actual human influencers. It's
That
coming
makes
for us all, Bobby. AI.
all of us, myself included, everybody. I'm an AI. No, I'm not. Thank you for answering that. Now a lot of the folks on this call today are, of course, brand managers or they're working with brands. So I think a question that we've got a little bit is, what sort of influencer content is going to drive the most engagement or even purchasing intent? Like if I'm a brand working with an influencer or trying to pick which influencer to work with, that's probably the thing I care about the most, right? Is like what's going to drive purchasing here.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think while we didn't look at content in this way in the survey, I think really from everything that I've seen, it's authentic product experiences. So it's things like, I tried this, so you don't have to. It's a tutorial, it's an honest review, it's a behind the scenes glimpse. That tends to go over better than a kind of overly polished or overproduced content. So if you kind of think about that, something that gives some information in combination with the other content nuances that I mentioned, like for example, the interest in day in the life content, the interest in comedy, putting those ingredients together can really provide a good recipe for success. And the other thing is, when it comes to the kind of authenticity and even production quality of influencer content, it's not that people will immediately balk at polished content, but it often does scream ad. And so we tend to find that, the content that's working better is content that feels a little more raw, a little more authentic, and something that aligns with the influencer's aesthetic. We saw all the reasons that people unfollow influencers, and a lot of those reasons were rooted in I'm not getting what I expected to be getting. So when a brand comes in and partners with an influencer and it doesn't feel natural or authentic to that influencer's voice, aesthetic, approach, cadence, any of those things, those are the things that tend to be a little bit jarring and not necessarily work as well. So I think it's a real combination of the kind of, the actual content and also the way that it's produced.
Yeah, just to remind folks where they can find that particular site that's so interesting. If you go to, Pro Dot, find this report, download it, and pull it up. I'm gonna scroll down here a little bit. This is where we have sort of that, in data and research about which content is the most likely factor in an unfollow. And it really kind of is, like Lindsay was saying, it's like the interesting it factor. So again, really encourage you downloading the full report and going deeper into it. Um, that sort of is a nice segue to another question we got, Lindsay, which is, what mistakes are brands making? Like, what are the biggest mistakes that brands are making in the influencer space right now?
Um, yeah, I think it's very closely related to the previous question, which is thinking about an influencer as an ad placement rather than a creative partnership.
Mhm.
I think often brands come into an influencer relationship and get, I mean, I spent a lot of time working at advertising agencies. I spent 11 years of my career working on the agency side. I know what a brief looks like. I know how many rounds of revision scripts have to go through and everything like that. And I think when you get to the point where it's too much of the brand and too little of the influencer, and you're not thinking of the influencer as a creative partner, that's when things kind of start to go awry. I mean, people follow influencers because they like them and because they trust their recommendations. So having something that feels off character for them really strips away the authenticity. And so I think the best campaigns really give the creators more creative control. They're often long-term collaborative opportunities. I think the brands that come in and just do a kind of one-shot thing, you don't get a chance to really find your rhythm in that partnership. And consumers can really instantly tell if an influencer genuinely believes in what they're promoting. And that lack of authenticity can be a detriment to both the brand and the influencer. You can lose followers for that, and the brand may not come off as well. So I think that the biggest mistake is really thinking that I don't want to say thinking that you know your brand the best, because as a brand manager, a brand steward, you are the one that knows your brand the best. But your influencer knows their audience the best and knows how what you think is important for your brand is going to translate to their audience. And so really thinking about it as a partnership rather than a transactional relationship, I guess.
That makes sense. Well, I think that's a great point for us to end on. So, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. This was a great conversation. We will be sending a deck and a link to the deck and the recording out later this afternoon. So, please keep your eyes in your inbox for that. If you have any questions or anything that we can do for you, please reach out to pro@morningconsult.com. I'm going to drop that email address in the chat right now. But with that being said, thank you again so much, Lindsay, for your time. This was a great presentation. I think very useful to our audience as well. And we will see you all again next time in the future. Thank you so much and have a wonderful Wednesday.
Thank you.